A struggling single dad walks into a small-town bakery for a job, only to discover the owner is the woman he once pulled from a wrecked car on a rainy night years ago. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The alarm buzzed far too early, but Michael Sanders was already half awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of their two-bedroom apartment. Winter crept through the worn window panes, its chill settling in his bones before he even kicked off the blanket. From the next room came the faint shuffle of small feet, followed by a thud and a soft, groggy, "Ah." "Lily," he called, rubbing his eyes. "You okay?" "Yeah," came the muffled response. "I just tripped over my backpack again." Michael smiled despite the heaviness in his chest. That backpack, overstuffed with glitter pens and crayon drawings, had become a permanent obstacle in the hallway. Life with Lily wasn't perfect, but it was real, and real was all he had to offer. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt toast, a regular morning ritual ever since their toaster decided medium meant charcoal. He popped 2 new slices in and glanced at the fridge. Bare, save for a carton of milk, a half-eaten apple, and 3 slices of bologna wrapped in a napkin. Payday had come and gone 2 weeks ago, and his severance had vanished even faster. "Breakfast, kiddo," he called, as Lily padded in wearing mismatched socks and a faded hoodie 2 sizes too big. Her hair stuck out in every direction, like a dandelion gone wild. "Is it toast again?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. "Deluxe toast," he replied, with a side of imagination. Lily giggled, climbing onto the wobbly kitchen chair. Tastes like pancakes." He leaned against the counter, watching her take exaggerated bites, pretending it was something fancier. These were the moments that kept him going, small, fleeting, and fragile. But the stack of unopened bills on the table loomed larger than his smile. He had filled out 6 job applications this week alone: mechanics, janitors, delivery drivers, anything that would put food on the table and gas in the tank. Still, nothing had come through. He checked his watch. "We gotta hustle or you'll be late." Lily hopped down, grabbing her backpack. "You'll find something today, Daddy," she said confidently, like it was already written in the stars. He forced a grin, kissed the top of her head, and locked the door behind them. Hope, it seemed, came wrapped in pigtails and peanut butter breath. The wind had picked up by mid-morning, whipping through the streets of downtown like it had something to prove. Michael tightened his coat around his chest, shoving his hands deep into the pockets as he made his way down Main Street. His breath came in small clouds, the kind that reminded him winter still had its claws deep in the town of Hartwell. He'd already been to 3 places that morning, 2 offered polite apologies, and 1 didn't even bother looking up from their clipboard. His feet were sore, his stomach was growling, and the bottom of his worn-out boots had started to take on water from the slush lining the sidewalks. He was just about to turn back toward the bus stop when a warm, buttery scent stopped him in his tracks. He looked up. Sweet Marie's Bakery. The sign above the shop was hand-painted, the kind of thing that had charm and history baked right into the brushstrokes. The front window was fogged around the edges, lit softly from within by the golden hue of hanging Edison bulbs. He was about to keep walking, after all. He knew nothing about baking, when something caught his eye in the lower corner of the glass. Help wanted, no experience necessary. Michael stood there for a moment, uncertain. He wasn't the kind of guy who wore aprons or knew how to pipe frosting, but the warmth spilling from the doorway and the smell of fresh bread told his stomach and his pride to sit this one out. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. It was like walking into another world, flour-dusted counters, rows of delicate pastries, and a quiet hum of something classical playing from a small radio near the register. It was simple, peaceful, and completely unlike the noise and grease of any shop he'd ever worked in. A woman stood behind the counter, kneading dough with practiced hands. She glanced up when she heard the bell, her sleeves rolled up, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She looked to be in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, calm, collected, but with eyes that held a tired kindness. "Hi there," she said, brushing her hands on a towel. "Can I help you?" Michael cleared his throat. "Actually, I saw the sign. About the job." Something flickered in her expression. Surprise, maybe, or something more complicated. But she smiled gently and nodded. "Well," she said, "you've come to the right place." Rose led him to a small table near the front window, away from the morning bustle of cinnamon rolls and coffee orders. The bakery was picking up pace. Regulars filtered in, murmuring greetings, the bell above the door chiming like a metronome. Still, she moved with a calm rhythm, as if chaos politely stepped aside for her. Michael sat, wiping his hands nervously on his jeans. He wasn't used to interviews that smelled like sugar and sounded like Vivaldi. He was more familiar with the clang of tools and the scent of oil-stained concrete. "So," Rose said, sliding a mug of coffee in front of him, "you ever worked in food service before?" Michael chuckled softly. "Only if making boxed mac and cheese for a 7-year-old counts." Her mouth curved in a smile that reached her eyes. There was something about her, familiar, maybe. Not in a we've met before kind of way, but in the way people sometimes just feel like home. "I'll be honest," he added, "I've worked in garages most of my life. Lost my job last month when the shop shut down. I'm willing to learn. I just need a shot." Rose studied him for a second. He had the kind of tired behind his eyes that came from more than lack of sleep. The kind that said, "I'm holding everything together with one hand and hoping it doesn't fall apart." "Tell me about your daughter," she said, gently changing lanes. Michael blinked, surprised. "Lily? She's everything. Bright, funny, talks a mile a minute. She loves art, hates green beans, and thinks I can fix anything." He smiled without realizing it. "She's the best thing I've ever done." Rose nodded, her fingers idly turning a spoon in her coffee. Something tugged at her, like a memory she couldn't quite name. His face, that voice. There was a warmth to him, a goodness. Michael, meanwhile, couldn't shake the feeling he knew her from somewhere. Maybe from around town? She had that kind of face. The kind people remembered, even if they couldn't say why. "All right," Rose said finally, standing. "You can start tomorrow. We open at 6. Michael rose, surprised by the quick decision. "Just like that?" She smiled again, soft, distant. "Sometimes you just know." Neither of them had any idea how true that would turn out to be. The snow had started falling by the time Michael stepped out of Sweet Marie's later that morning, the flakes drifting down in slow, lazy spirals. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, stunned. Part-time work. Starting tomorrow, in a bakery of all places. He hadn't expected it, especially not from a woman who barely knew his name. Inside, Rose leaned against the counter, watching him disappear into the snowy street. Her heart was racing a little, and she couldn't quite explain why. It wasn't just his story, though that had pulled at something tender in her chest. It was the way he looked at the world, steady, worn down, but not bitter. There was something familiar in his quiet humility. Something grounding. She'd had a dozen people apply for the job over the last month. College students, retirees, folks looking to kill time. But none of them had made her pause the way Michael had, and none of them had brought a childlike spark to the bakery just by mentioning a daughter who thought he could fix anything. Back home that evening, Michael sat across the table from Lily, who was spooning alphabet soup into her mouth like it was a 5-star meal. "So," she said between slurps, "did you get the job?" "I did." He smiled, still a little in disbelief. "I start tomorrow, part-time, but it's something." Lily beamed. "Yay, do you get to make cupcakes?" He laughed. "I have no idea. I told her I've never baked a thing in my life." "She must be really nice," Lily said, and Michael nodded, his thoughts drifting back to Rose. "She is. Kind of serious, but kind." Later that night, as Lily slept curled up in her blanket fort of stuffed animals, Michael stared out the window, watching the snow collect on the fire escape. He thought about the warm lights of the bakery, the soft scent of vanilla in the air, and the woman with flour on her cheek who had looked at him like he wasn't just a broken man trying to get by, but someone worth trusting. Maybe, he thought, this was the start of something, not just a job, something more, something he didn't even have a name for yet. The scent of yeast and cinnamon clung to Michael's clothes by the end of his first shift, like a second skin. He hadn't known dough could stick to so many things, his hands, his sleeves, somehow even the laces of his boots. The morning had been a blur of flour clouds and metal trays, timer buzzes and Rose's calm, efficient movements guiding him through the motions. By 6:30 a.m., his fingers were stiff and dusted white, and his pride was bruised from accidentally knocking over an entire tray of rising croissants. Rose hadn't raised her voice once. "Don't worry," she'd said, crouching to help him clean up the buttery mess. "Everyone fumbles their first batch. The dough's forgiving. People are harder." He wasn't sure if she was talking about croissants or herself. The rhythm of bakery life was unlike anything he'd known. No roaring engines, no shouting over clanging tools, just the hum of mixers, the soft tap of rolling pins, and the occasional rustle of newspaper from the few early risers who came in before dawn for coffee and quiet. Rose moved through the space with the ease of someone who'd built it with her own two hands. She didn't micromanage, didn't hover. She taught by doing, letting him follow her movements until they started to feel natural, or at least less foreign. And every so often, in between shaping loaves or brushing egg wash on pastries, she'd ask small questions. "Do you drink your coffee black? Was Lily named after someone? Ever think about moving somewhere warmer?" Michael didn't have big answers. He just told the truth. He liked bitter coffee and warm bread. Lily was named after a song her mother used to sing. And no, he hadn't thought about leaving. Hartwell might be cold and quiet, but it was home, the only one they had left. By the time the sun finally peeked through the front window, casting a golden wash over the counter, Michael was bone-tired, but lighter somehow. Rose handed him a to-go box before he left. Inside were 2 warm muffins and a note scribbled in quick, tidy handwriting. "You're getting the hang of it. See you tomorrow." He stood on the sidewalk for a long time, the box warm in his hands, and felt something he hadn't felt in a while. Hope, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance. The rain was falling hard in her dream, fat, angry drops pelting the windshield as wipers thrashed uselessly from side to side. Headlights smeared against the glass like pale ghosts. Everything was noise, tires hissing, horns blaring, her own breath short and shallow. The curve in the road came too fast. She couldn't slow down in time. And then impact, the sound of metal folding in on itself, the sickening jolt of her body slamming forward, glass shattering, screams but not hers. Silence. Rose jolted upright in bed, her sheets tangled around her legs like restraints. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths as her eyes adjusted to the dark. The bakery loft was quiet, save for the ticking of the old wall clock in the kitchen below and the faint whistle of wind outside. She pressed her palms against her eyes and leaned forward, trying to shake off the weight of memory, but it clung to her like smoke, bitter and choking. 5 years. It had been 5 years since that night. A late meeting, too much rain, a winding country road she thought she knew like the back of her hand, and then the crash, the airbag exploding in her face, the seatbelt biting into her collarbone, and the man, the stranger who'd pulled her from the twisted wreck, blood running down his temple, his voice calm even as she trembled in shock. She never saw his face clearly, just strong arms, a gentle grip, and eyes that looked into hers and promised, "You're okay now." She had never gotten his name. He had vanished before the ambulance arrived like some kind of ghost. Everyone told her to move on. She had lived. She should be grateful, and she was, grateful and broken in ways she didn't know how to name. The bakery became her lifeline, her way to rebuild. Flour, sugar, dough, all things she could control, shape, make beautiful again. But some nights, like tonight, The crash came back in vivid color, and she'd wake alone, cold, despite the blankets, still hearing the crunch of metal and that stranger's voice echoing in the spaces of her heart she thought she'd sealed shut. Rose got out of bed and padded barefoot to the window. Snow drifted quietly over Hartwell. Peaceful, like nothing bad had ever happened here. She wondered if he remembered her at all. The bakery door chimed around mid-morning, just as Rose was pulling a fresh tray of blueberry muffins from the oven. The warmth of cinnamon and sugar hung thick in the air, mingling with the soft jazz playing from the corner speaker. She glanced up from the counter, expecting another regular in search of their caffeine fix. Instead, a small girl burst in, bright-eyed, cheeks pink from the cold, a knit hat slipping sideways off her head. She skidded slightly on the tiled floor before steadying herself with a proud grin. "Hi," she said loud and clear, like she'd been practicing it. Michael followed a second later, looking sheepish. "Sorry," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Lily insisted on seeing where I work. I figured one quick hello wouldn't hurt." Rose smiled, wiping her hands on a towel. "She's more than welcome." Lily beamed and wandered closer to the glass pastry case, her wide eyes taking in the rows of croissants and cinnamon buns like they were treasure. "Are these all real?" she whispered. Rose laughed. "They're real and made fresh every morning." Lily pressed her fingers to the glass. "They look like a fairy tale. Would you like to try one?" Lily turned to her dad, her hands already clasped in a silent plea. Michael pretended to consider, then nodded with exaggerated seriousness. "Only if you promise not to eat the whole tray." She settled on a muffin, blueberry with just the right amount of crumble, and took a careful bite before closing her eyes in pure, dramatic delight. "Okay," she said. "This is the best muffin in the entire world." Rose's heart tugged unexpectedly. Something about Lily, the way she smiled so open and unguarded, sent a ripple through her chest. A faint, half-buried memory tugged at her. A little girl in the back seat of a car on a rainy road, eyes wide, waving shyly through fogged glass as a stranger helped her mother from the wreck. She blinked the memory away. "You've got good taste," Rose said, leaning down slightly. "Want to come back sometime and help me make a batch?" Lily's jaw dropped. "Really?" Michael gave Rose a look, surprised, maybe touched. And she couldn't explain it, not fully, but it felt right, familiar, like a circle slowly beginning to close. "Yes," Rose said softly. "Really." The bakery was quiet in the lull between the morning rush and the lunch crowd. A soft snow fell outside, dusting the windows in delicate frost, while inside the oven hummed and the smell of rising bread filled the air like a warm blanket. Rose stood at the counter, measuring flour, her movements slow and thoughtful. Michael was in the back, wiping down trays, humming some old song under his breath that sounded like something from the 70s. She caught herself watching him again, something she'd done more often lately. Not in the way you watch someone you're curious about, but in that deeper, searching kind of way. As if there was a missing piece she was trying to fit into place. He leaned down to adjust the baking rack, his movements easy, practiced, not just as a worker, but as someone who paid attention to detail, someone who took care. The way he held the hot pans with quiet precision, the way he had lifted Lily's backpack this morning without thinking twice, the way he always made sure to look people in the eye when he spoke. And then it happened. He turned toward her, wiping his hands on his apron, and smiled. Just a simple, fleeting smile. But it triggered something, a flash in her mind, as clear as it had been 5 years ago. The pounding rain, the spinning headlights, her car crumpled like a tin can on the side of the road, her own breath ragged in her chest, the overwhelming panic. And then, him. That voice, calm, steady. "You're okay now." The eyes, warm but resolute, holding hers as he gently lifted her from the wreckage, ignoring the glass cutting into his arms, the blood on his forehead. Rose's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, staring at him like she was seeing him for the first time. "Michael," she said softly. He looked up. Yeah? She hesitated, her hand resting on the edge of the counter. Her pulse thundered in her ears. I think we've met before. His brow furrowed. We have? She nodded slowly. 5 years ago, rainy night. Car crash just outside of town. You pulled me out. Michael froze, the cloth in his hand falling to the floor. And just like that, the air between them changed. No longer just warm and flower-scented, but charged with something unspoken, something remembered. The next morning the snow had stopped, but a quiet stillness lingered in the air, as if the world was holding its breath. Inside the bakery, the routine began like usual, Michael prepping the morning trays, Rose checking inventory, but neither spoke much, not like before. The words between them had changed, even if they hadn't been fully said yet. Rose waited until the ovens were set and the first customers had filtered in and out. The shop was warm, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the faint aroma of lemon zest from a cooling pound cake. She found Michael at the back table, tying a string around a box of cookies for a special order. "Michael," she said quietly. He looked up, hands stilling. "Yeah?" She walked over slowly, wiping her palms on her apron more out of nerves than flour. "What I said yesterday? Do you remember?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I've been thinking about it all night." Rose sat across from him, folding her hands. "It was you, wasn't it?" His jaw clenched slightly, but he didn't look away. "Yeah, it was me." She exhaled, like she'd been holding her breath for years. "Why didn't you say anything?" He shrugged, eyes falling to the string in his hands. "Didn't think it mattered. You were hurt. I just did what anyone would have done." "But not everyone did," she said gently. "People drove by that night. You didn't. You stopped. You pulled me out of that car. You saved my life." Michael rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't stick around. I didn't know if you were okay." "I was. Eventually." She offered a faint smile. "Long recovery, months of physical therapy. But I walked away, thanks to you." For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't heavy, it was full. Of things unsaid, of pieces falling into place. "I never thought you'd end up here," he admitted. "Owning a bakery in a town like this?" Rose laughed softly. "Neither did I. But after the accident I needed something real, something quiet. Baking gave me that. This place gave me that." Michael looked at her then, really looked at her, and the air between them felt like something new, fragile, honest, and unfinished. "I'm glad you're here," she said, "and not just because you're good with dough." He smiled, slow, surprised, a little stunned. "I'm glad too." The rain had started again by late afternoon, soft and steady, tapping against the bakery windows in a rhythm that made Rose's skin prickle. The memory of that night still sat heavy in her chest after their conversation earlier. She had thought about it for years, wondering who he was, what had happened to him. And now he was here, folding parchment and measuring flour, like fate had dropped him quietly into her life a second time. The bakery had emptied out early. Rain did that in Hartwell, and the warm lights above cast a gentle glow across the wooden counters. Michael was wiping down the front table, slow and thoughtful, the silence stretching comfortably between them until Rose spoke. "Will you tell me your side of it?" she asked softly. He looked up, surprised. "You really want to know?" "I do." Michael leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. He stared out the rain-speckled window for a moment before nodding. "It was just supposed to be a normal night," he began. "Lily was asleep in the back seat. I'd picked up a shift at a shop out near Ridgeway and was driving home through the back roads. Then I saw your car, crumpled up against the guardrail, hazard lights blinking, one headlight barely hanging on." Rose said nothing, her breath held as he continued. "I almost didn't stop," he admitted. "It was raining hard and Lily was in the car, but something, I don't know, I just couldn't keep driving. I parked on the shoulder and ran over." His voice dropped, quieter now. "The door was jammed. I remember you were conscious but dazed, bleeding from your forehead. The car smelled like gas. I didn't even think. I just pulled you out." "I remember your arms," Rose murmured, "and your voice." Michael smiled faintly. "You kept trying to ask if I was okay. Even when you could barely stand, you were shivering and bleeding but worried about me." She blinked, her throat tightening. "I waited until the ambulance showed up, but once they started pulling you away, I panicked. I didn't want to explain why I had a kid in the car, why I wasn't calling someone. I just got back in and drove off." "You didn't know my name," she said quietly. "No," he replied, "but I never forgot your face." The rain continued to fall, soft and steady, and for the first time in years, the night that had haunted them both began to lose its sharp edges, softened by the truth and the quiet understanding blooming between them. The bakery had never felt quite like this before. Rose moved through her morning routine with practiced ease, kneading, measuring, sliding trays into the warm belly of the oven, but everything felt a beat slower, as if her body was doing the work while her heart wandered elsewhere. Michael stood at the prep table across from her, focused on learning how to shape the morning buns just right, his brow furrowed in concentration. Flour dusted his dark hair and clung to the creases of his worn shirt. He didn't look like the hero from that night. He looked like the man he was now, quiet, kind, steady, the kind of man who showed up when it counted and didn't make a show of it. And somehow, that made him more unforgettable. She caught herself watching him again, eyes lingering a little too long, not just because of the past they now shared, but because of the way he had slipped so naturally into her life, into this life. The calm rhythm of early mornings, the conversations over cooling racks, the sound of his laughter blending with Lily's when they came in on Sundays to supervise. She hadn't meant to feel anything, not after the accident, not after Tom. But now, every time Michael handed her a tray without being asked or offered that quiet smile that said more than words ever could, something stirred in her. Gratitude, yes, but something deeper, something warmer. Hope. It frightened her more than she wanted to admit, because hope had teeth. It could crumble like an overbaked loaf if you leaned on it too hard. "Hey," Michael said, nudging her gently with a knuckle as he held up his sad attempt at a pastry spiral. "Be honest. How bad is it?" She blinked, startled from her thoughts, and looked down at the lopsided dough in his hands. It was a mess, but it was endearing. "It's terrible," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. "But it has character." He laughed, eyes crinkling. "I'll take it." Their hands brushed as she reached to fix the twist, and for a moment neither of them pulled away. The warmth between them lingered like cinnamon on the air, quiet, familiar, and new all at once. The timer blared a second too late. Michael yanked open the oven door, a rush of heat spilling into the kitchen like a wave. Smoke curled up from the tray inside, and a charred, crispy smell filled the bakery. Definitely not the scent they were aiming for. I think we can safely say those are toast," he muttered, pulling the tray out and grimacing at the blackened edges of what were supposed to be golden, fluffy cinnamon rolls. Rose turned from the sink, eyebrows lifted. "Michael," she said, half scolding, half amused, "I told you to set the timer for 12 minutes. "I did," he said, setting the tray down with an exaggerated sigh. "But apparently I also forgot I'm not a mind reader when it comes to convection ovens." She smirked, walking over and peering at the rolls. "Well, if we ever open a bakery for dragons, you've nailed it." He laughed, shaking his head. "I'm pretty sure Lily could have done better blindfolded." She nudged him with her elbow. "We've all burned a batch or two. The trick is not taking it personally." "Easy for you to say," he said, crossing his arms. "You make it all look effortless." Rose leaned against the counter beside him. "It's not. It just gets easier when you stop being afraid to mess up." Michael looked at her then, really looked. Her cheeks were pink from the heat, a strand of hair had slipped loose from her bun, and flour dusted the edge of her jaw. She didn't try to hide the smile tugging at her lips. There was a moment, just the two of them, the ruined roles between them, and something unspoken hanging in the air. Not tension exactly, but the awareness of closeness, of how easy it was suddenly to be here like this, laughing over mistakes, standing shoulder to shoulder. "You've got flour," he said, gently reaching up. His fingers brushed her cheek, soft and unsure. She didn't move away. A breath caught between them. Her eyes lifted to his, warm and searching, and then, just as quickly, she turned, brushing the hair from her face and laughing. "Well," she said, breaking the moment with grace, "guess we better try again." But her voice was a little softer, and his heart was beating a little faster. The bakery was closed on Sundays, officially anyway. The sign on the door said, "See you Monday," in cheerful cursive, but inside the lights were always on by sunrise, not for customers, just for them. Michael and Lily had started coming by a few weeks back. At first it was to help Rose catch up on prep for the busy week ahead. Now it had become something else, a quiet ritual, a slow, gentle rhythm of mixing, laughter, and warmth. That Sunday morning Rose was already rolling out dough when the bell above the door jingled, soft like a whisper. She didn't flinch, she just smiled. Lily burst in first, her pigtails bouncing, a glittery sticker sheet clutched in one mittened hand. "Miss Rose, guess what? I brought my best muffin ideas." Michael followed, holding a tray of hot cocoa from the shop down the street. "And I brought caffeine. Priorities." Rose chuckled, brushing flour from her hands. "You two always come bearing gifts." They settled in like they belonged there. Lily took over the corner booth, spreading out her stickers, crayons, and a notebook full of muffin inventions, peanut butter banana marshmallow swirl being the latest, most chaotic entry. Michael rolled up his sleeves and joined Rose at the counter, where a second lump of dough waited. "Same recipe?" he asked. Rose nodded. "Let's see if you can keep from setting something on fire this time." He smirked. "One burnt tray and I'm branded for life." The hours passed easily. No pressure, no rush. Just music humming low from the radio, the clatter of mixing bowls, and Lily's occasional commentary from her booth. "That one's crooked," or "I'd give that muffin a 7 out of 10. It needs sprinkles." Rose watched them when they weren't looking, Michael laughing as he tried to braid a loaf of challah, Lily humming as she stuck stickers to her boots. It was the kind of morning she never used to imagine for herself because she hadn't known it was possible. Peace didn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it came in the form of cocoa steam, shared smiles, and the sound of a child's giggle echoing in a quiet, flour-dusted bakery. And Rose, who once thought Sundays were just days to recover from the week, now found herself counting down to them. By Wednesday, the whispers had begun. Hartwell was the kind of town where nothing stayed a secret for long. People noticed things, especially when they were starved for something new to talk about between weather complaints and grocery store price hikes. And when a quiet, closed-off baker suddenly started smiling more, folks took notice. It started innocently enough. A customer would step into Sweet Marie's, order their usual, and ask casually, "So who's the new guy?" Rose would answer simply, "Michael. He's helping out a few days a week," and leave it at that. But the look in her eyes didn't go unnoticed. The way she said his name with a softness that hadn't been there before. The more perceptive townspeople saw more than just a new hire. They saw Rose laughing behind the counter again. They saw her wiping flour on Michael's sleeve when she thought no one was looking. They saw Lily perched on the edge of a barstool Sunday mornings, bossing both of them around with the authority of a child who knows she's deeply loved. Maggie Kemp, who ran the flower shop next door, leaned over the counter one morning with a knowing grin. "It's nice to see someone putting that smile back on your face, Rosie." Rose flushed, reaching for the receipt pad a little too quickly. "It's not like that. He's just helping out." "Uh-huh," Maggie said, not bothering to hide her amusement. "And I'm just here for the coffee." Rose couldn't help it. She smiled. A little too wide, a little too easy. The thing was, she wasn't trying to hide it. Not really. But she also didn't know what it was. Whatever was growing between her and Michael wasn't loud or rushed. It was slow and steady, like bread rising in a warm room. She wasn't used to attention, especially the kind that came with raised eyebrows and nudges. Still, when Michael caught her eye across the bakery that afternoon, flour smudged on his jaw and a goofy grin aimed at Lily, something inside her fluttered. Let them whisper, she thought, turning back to her dough with a soft laugh. For once, she didn't mind being the story. The bakery had gone quiet for the night. The last crumbs had been swept from the floor, the lights dimmed to a golden hush. Rose sat on the back step just outside the kitchen, a cup of tea warming her hands, watching the sky fade into a blanket of stars. The hum of the town had died down, leaving only the occasional car in the distance and the soft chirp of crickets in the alley. Michael stepped out a moment later, 2 mugs in hand. "Didn't think you'd still be here," he said, offering her one. She took it with a grateful nod. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd let the dough rise and do the same." He sat beside her, not too close, but close enough to feel the comfort of his presence. They drank in silence for a while. It wasn't awkward, just thoughtful. After a long pause, Rose set her mug down and folded her hands in her lap. "I should probably tell you about Tom." Michael looked over at her. "You don't have to." "No," she said, her voice low. "I do." She didn't look at him as she spoke, just stared out into the night, like the words lived somewhere beyond the shadows. "We were engaged," she said quietly. "Tom and I. For almost a year. He was charming, put together, successful. On paper, the whole deal. We were planning a wedding. A life." She swallowed. Then the crash happened. Michael didn't interrupt. He just waited, listening. "I remember waking up in the hospital, tubes in my arms, body bruised inside and out. And Tom," her voice faltered. "He wasn't there, not at first. Then, when he finally did show up, he didn't stay long. Said he couldn't handle watching me like that it was too much, too hard." A bitter laugh slipped from her lips. "He wanted the picture-perfect version of me, the one who smiled in photos and baked on weekends, not the one broken and scared and starting from scratch." Michael's hands tightened around his mug, but he said nothing. "He left," Rose finished, "and I told myself I didn't need anyone after that I was better off doing life alone." She finally looked at him. "So if I seem guarded sometimes, it's not you. It's just that I know what it feels like when someone promises forever, and bolts the second things get real." Michael nodded, his voice steady. "I'm not him." "I know," she whispered. And somehow that made it even scarier. The sun had barely crested over Hartwell when the scent of vanilla and warm butter filled the bakery. The ovens were preheating, the kitchen bathed in that soft, golden light that made everything look a little more magical than it really was. Michael was already elbow-deep in dough, sleeves rolled up and hair slightly tousled from the early start. Rose stood across the counter from him, her apron tied neatly, brows furrowed in concentration as she piped swirls of icing onto a batch of lemon scones. It was quiet, companionable, the kind of silence that felt full instead of empty. "Okay," Michael said, eyeing his misshapen lump of dough. "What's the secret to getting this thing to stop fighting back?" Rose smirked, not looking up. "You're trying to control it too much. Bread's like people. It needs room to breathe." "Right. Breathe. Got it." He pressed again, too firmly, and the dough squelched defiantly. She looked over and stifled a laugh. "You're manhandling it." "I'm encouraging it," he said, grinning. "Tough love." "Here," she said, moving to his side. "Let me show you." She reached for his hands, guiding them over the dough, her fingers brushing his. Gentle pressure. Let it shape itself. Michael turned slightly to glance at her, just as her elbow nudged the edge of the flour bowl. A puff of white exploded between them, dusting her apron, his arm, and part of his face. Rose froze, eyes wide. Michael blinked, then broke into a wide, flour-smudged grin. "So that's how you teach humility around here." She laughed, a real full laugh, and before she could stop herself, dipped her fingers into the flour bowl and flicked a pinch at him. "Oh, it's on now," he said, grabbing his own handful. They were both laughing as flour flew through the air, covering aprons, countertops, and hair. Lily would have declared it a war zone of powdered sugar and pastry casualties. When the clouds of flour finally settled, Rose leaned against the counter, breathless and glowing, her cheeks flushed pink and her eyes bright. Michael wiped a streak of flour from her cheek with his thumb, slower than necessary. Their eyes met. Something shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't sudden, but it was there. Something new had begun, as quiet and natural as bread rising in a warm oven. It started with a casual offer, the kind said with a shrug and a smile. Meant to sound like nothing, meant to feel safe. "You know," Rose said one afternoon as she wiped down the front counter, "I still owe you dinner for saving me from the great flour ambush of last week." Michael, stacking trays behind her, chuckled. "I think we're even, after I accidentally made those sugar cookies taste like salt." She turned, a slight smirk tugging at her lips. "Still, let me cook. Just a simple dinner, my way of saying thanks." He hesitated only a second before nodding. "Sure, sounds nice." But by the time he stood outside her place 3 nights later, holding a cheap bouquet of daisies Lily had insisted he bring, the word simple felt like a lie. Rose's house was tucked just behind the town square, a modest little place with a porch swing and lights strung along the eaves. Warmth poured out the front windows. Through the glass he saw her moving in the kitchen, hair tied back, music playing softly in the background. He hadn't felt this nervous since his first high school dance. She opened the door before he could knock, already smiling. "You're early." "Blame Lily," he said, holding out the flowers. "She says I'm hopeless without supervision." Rose laughed, accepting the bouquet. "She's not wrong." Inside, the smell of garlic and tomatoes wrapped around him like a blanket. A pot simmered on the stove, and a small table was set with mismatched plates and a flickering candle that tried to pretend it wasn't romantic. They ate pasta and homemade bread, drinking red wine from juice glasses, talking about everything and nothing. Childhood stories, the worst jobs they'd ever had, her habit of baking when she couldn't sleep, his guilty obsession with old westerns. It was easy, too easy. After dinner, they moved to the porch with a second glass of wine. The sky was ink dark, stars pricking through like secrets. The silence between them was soft and waiting. "You know this isn't just dinner," Michael said finally, his voice low. Rose nodded. "I know." She didn't stop him when he reached for her hand, and when she leaned her head on his shoulder, a few minutes later, neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. The bell above the bakery door jingled just after noon, when the lunch crowd had thinned and the lull between batches offered a rare, quiet stretch. Rose glanced up from the register, expecting to see one of her regulars, maybe Maggie from the flower shop or old Mr. Dalton with his usual 2 rye rolls and a joke. Instead, it was Tom, her breath caught for half a second, the smile on her face vanishing before it fully formed. He stood just inside the door, too clean, too crisp, like he didn't belong in a place that smelled like cinnamon and sounded like soft jazz. Same expensive coat, same carefully styled hair, same eyes that once looked at her like a prize he could place on a shelf. "Rose," he said, stepping forward like no time had passed. She swallowed hard. "Tom, what are you doing here?" "I was passing through," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thought I'd stop in. I heard you were still in Hartwell." Michael walked out from the kitchen, towel over his shoulder, laughing at something Lily had said earlier. He froze mid-step when he saw the man standing across from Rose, the air shifting instantly. Tom turned slightly, sizing him up with the subtle arrogance of someone who assumed he was the most important man in the room. "And this is?" Rose stepped in, tone level. "This is Michael. He works here, and he's a friend." Michael nodded, offering a polite but cautious, "Hey." Tom's gaze flicked to him, then back to Rose, his smile tightening. "Didn't think you were the type to stick around in a place like this, let alone open a bakery." Rose bristled. "You never really knew what I was the type for." The moment hung there, heavy, awkward. Michael stepped back, murmuring something about checking the back oven, even though there was nothing baking. He could feel the knot forming in his chest, slow and sour. Later, as he restocked shelves in silence, Rose found him, arms crossed and expression unreadable. "He's no one," she said softly. "He doesn't get to just walk in and rewrite the past." Michael looked at her, searching her face. "Are you sure he's not here to try?" She met his gaze. "I'm sure, but I'm not sure you believe me yet." And that, more than anything, hurt. Tom showed up the next morning with the kind of confidence that came dressed in tailored suits and polished shoes, like the years between now and the accident had never happened. He stepped into Sweet Marie's just after the morning rush, his presence cutting through the cozy air like a cold draft. Rose was behind the counter, apron dusted with flour, a smudge of chocolate on her wrist from the early muffin batch. She saw him approach and instinctively straightened, her smile polite but distant. "I won't take up much of your time," he said, sliding a sleek envelope onto the counter like he was closing a business deal. "But I think you'll want to read this." She wiped her hands and opened it carefully. Her eyes scanned the first page, then again. He waited, smug and assured. "It's an offer," she said, voice flat. "To buy the bakery," he confirmed. "I've been talking with a developer. Hartwell's changing, whether you like it or not. You're sitting on prime property, and you could walk away with more money than this place will ever give you in a lifetime." She blinked, stunned by the audacity. "Why would you think I'd want that?" "Because you're better than this," he said simply. "This place, this town, it's small. You were meant for more. I always knew that." She stared at him, her fingers curling slightly around the paper. "Come back to the city," he continued, lowering his voice. "Start something new, with me, if you want." Rose flinched. "You left." "I panicked," he admitted. "I was scared, but I've changed." She looked at him, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw the man he used to be, the charm, the ambition, the comfort of someone who once knew her well. But then she thought of Michael, of flour on his face, of Lily's laughter echoing off the bakery walls, of quiet Sunday mornings and slow, safe moments that had healed parts of her she didn't even know were broken. "I need time to think," she said finally. Tom smiled like he'd already won. "Take all the time you need." But as he walked out, her fingers brushed the edge of the offer, and her heart tugged in the opposite direction, toward the life she hadn't expected, but maybe, just maybe, had begun to love. The days that followed were colder than usual, and not just because winter had deepened its grip on Hartwell. Michael came in on time, did his work, and left with barely more than a few polite words. Gone were the quiet jokes and warm glances across the kitchen, the playful teasing, the easy silences that had once meant comfort. Now the quiet felt sharp, measured. Rose felt it the moment he stepped through the door that Monday. He avoided her eyes, busied himself with the dough like it held all the answers he didn't want to ask for. She tried to pretend it didn't bother her, but it settled in her chest like a stone. It wasn't hard to guess why. Word traveled fast in Hartwell, and Tom hadn't exactly been subtle about his offer or his intentions. By Wednesday, the distance between them felt impossible to ignore. Rose finally cornered him near the back shelf, where he was reorganizing baking pans that didn't need reorganizing. "Michael," she said quietly, arms crossed. He didn't turn around. "Yeah?" She stepped closer. "Is something going on?" He shrugged. "Don't want to get in the way." "In the way of what?" He turned then, eyes tired. "Of whatever it is you're deciding." She blinked. heart stuttering. "You think I'm choosing between you and Tom?" "I think he's offering you a way out," Michael said, his voice calm, but laced with something deeper. "A clean break, a bigger life, one you used to want." "And what," she asked, frustration creeping in, "makes you think I still want that?" He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "Because you haven't told him no." The words hit harder than she expected. Because it was true, she hadn't. Not because she wanted Tom back, but because some part of her was still untangling what he'd meant to her, what he still meant, if anything. "I'm not her anymore," she said, her voice low. "The woman who thought she needed perfect, who thought love had to look shiny to be real." Michael nodded once, jaw tight. "Maybe, but it doesn't mean you're not still figuring it out." He walked away before she could say another word, the sound of his footsteps leaving cracks in the calm she'd tried so hard to hold on to. And this time, it wasn't the crust that had broken, it was something closer to her heart. The drawing was left on the bakery counter, like a little love letter to a world only a child could see clearly. Michael found it just after closing, tucked beneath a stray napkin near the register. At first, he thought it was just another scrap of paper Lily had been doodling on. She was always scribbling during their slow Sunday mornings at Sweet Marie's, but as he peeled it free and turned it over, he froze. It was a crayon sketch, bright and uneven in the way only a 7-year-old's hand could make something so heartbreakingly pure. 3 stick figures stood behind the bakery's curved glass display case, one with spiky black hair, a smudge of blue apron drawn with extra care, one smaller with 2 round pigtails and a muffin in each hand, and one with long brown hair, smiling under the hand-lettered title, "My Bakery Family." Michael swallowed hard. His name was scribbled in purple above the tall figure, Daddy. Next to it, me, in bubble letters with hearts around it. And just above the third figure, drawn in pink and gold, Miss Rose. Something in him cracked open. He sat down at one of the empty tables, the drawing shaking slightly in his hands. The bakery was quiet now, the lights soft, the scent of sugar and cinnamon still lingering from the last batch of snickerdoodles. Outside, snow tapped at the window like it had something to say. All week, he'd been pulling away, guarding himself, letting old fears and old insecurities whisper lies in his ear. "You're just a chapter, not the whole story. She'll leave, like they always do." But here it was, in crayon and construction paper, the truth, drawn in a child's unwavering love. This life, flower-streaked, warm, imperfect, wasn't temporary. It was already taking root, in Lily, in Rose, in him. Rose stepped out from the kitchen a moment later, wiping her hands on a towel, her expression cautious. "I was just cleaning up," she said quietly. Michael held up the drawing, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She sees it," he said, "even when I didn't." Rose's gaze softened, and for the first time in days, the space between them felt like it might be something they could cross again, something worth saving. Tom returned on a Thursday. Rose heard his car before she saw it. Too sleek, too loud for the quiet street outside Sweet Marie's. He stepped inside the bakery just after the breakfast crowd had cleared, looking every bit the man who'd never stopped thinking the world revolved around him. She didn't greet him this time. She simply folded her arms and waited as he approached the counter with that same polished smile. "Well?" he asked, confident, like the offer was a formality, and her silence had already meant yes. "Have you thought about it?" Rose nodded slowly. "I have." He leaned in. "And?" She reached under the counter and slid the envelope back across the surface to him, unopened. "No." The word hung in the air, simple and final. Tom blinked, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "No? Rose, I'm offering you a real chance. Out of this place, out of this life." She looked around the bakery, at the soft light filtering in through the windows, the half-empty pastry case, the sound of Lily's laughter echoing faintly from the back room where she was helping Michael sort cookie cutters. "This is my life," she said, "and for the first time in a long time, it feels like it's mine." Tom's smile faltered. "You're throwing away everything you could have had, everything you used to want." She held his gaze, steady now. "Maybe, or maybe I'm choosing something better." He glanced toward the kitchen, where Michael's voice rose in a low chuckle. Warm, genuine, safe. "Is this about him?" "It's about me," Rose replied, "and the version of myself I only found after everything fell apart." Tom stood there stunned for a moment too long. Then, wordlessly, he took the envelope, tucked it back into his coat, and left without another word. Rose exhaled slowly. Her hands trembled, but her heart was steady. Later, as she returned to the kitchen, Michael looked up from the table where Lily was proudly showing off her latest lopsided sugar cookie. His eyes met hers, uncertain but hopeful. She walked over, brushing a kiss against Lily's head, then turned to Michael. "He's gone," she said simply. Michael raised an eyebrow. "For good?" Rose smiled. "For better." The storm rolled in faster than anyone expected. By late afternoon, the sky over Hartwell had turned a deep, bruised gray. Wind howled down Main Street, rattling windows and whipping signs until they swung like chimes in a rising panic. The rain came next, sheets of it, hammering rooftops and flooding gutters in minutes. Rose stood at the front window of Sweet Marie's, watching the storm gather force, her phone buzzing with weather alerts, flash flood warnings, downed power lines, roads closing in every direction. She had just finished clearing the front display case when the first sound came, a sharp, unnatural crack from the back wall. The lights flickered. Water snaked in from beneath the side door, dark and steady, soaking the tiled floor. Her heart dropped. She ran to the back, towels in hand, trying to stop the rush of water from breaching the prep area. The drains were already overwhelmed. Flour bags stacked in the corner were starting to dampen. She knew what was coming. Loss, real loss. Not like a burnt tray or a slow sales day. This was her foundation, her safe place. And it was filling with water. Somewhere in the chaos, her phone rang. "Michael." "Are you still at the bakery?" he asked, his voice tense beneath the static. "Yes," she breathed. "I can't leave. The storm came in too fast. There's water everywhere." "I'm coming," he said without hesitation. "Michael, no, the roads." But he'd already hung up. 20 minutes later, headlights cut through the downpour, and Michael burst through the back entrance, soaked to the skin and out of breath. He took one look around. Water up to their ankles now, ingredients ruined, cords floating dangerously, and moved into action. "Power's off," he said, yanking the main switch. "We need to get everything off the floor, now." They worked side by side in silence, hauling equipment, stacking bags of sugar, lifting mixers onto shelves. The rain pounded the roof like war drums, the wind threatening to splinter the glass. At one point, Rose slipped, nearly falling. Michael caught her mid-stumble, his arms tight around her, eyes searching hers. "I told you not to come," she whispered, shaking. He just held her closer. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." And in that flooded, flickering bakery, surrounded by ruin and rising water, Rose realized she wasn't afraid of losing the shop. She was afraid of losing him. By the time the storm passed, the bakery was quiet again, too quiet. Water still pooled near the back door, trickling in shallow currents across the floor. The smell of wet wood and rain hung in the air, mingling with the sharp scent of disinfectant and damp flour. The power was still out, the only light coming from a flashlight propped against a mixing bowl, casting soft, flickering shadows on the walls. Michael sat on an overturned crate near the prep table, soaked to the bone, sleeves clinging to his arms, boots heavy with water. Rose leaned against the wall across from him, equally drenched, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders that wasn't doing much to chase the chill. Neither of them spoke at first. The adrenaline had drained out, leaving only quiet exhaustion and the steady sound of their breathing. "You should be home," Rose said eventually, her voice low. "So should you," Michael replied, meeting her gaze. "But I guess we're both too stubborn for that." She smiled faintly, but it faded just as quickly. It could have been worse. It still might be, he said honestly. The floor's damaged. Oven's probably done. You might lose the week, maybe more. Rose nodded slowly. I know. Michael stood, stretching out his stiff back, then walked over, pulling another dry blanket from a supply shelf. He draped it over her shoulders without a word, his hands lingering just a second too long. She looked up at him, eyes tired and glassy. Why'd you come back? He hesitated. Because I couldn't not. And then, like something inside her finally gave way, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him. The embrace was soft at first, tentative, but when he returned it, something broke open. All the distance, all the second-guessing, the hesitations and unspoken feelings, they dissolved under the weight of that simple, quiet closeness. She pressed her face into his chest, breathing him in, rain, flower, and something warm underneath it all. He held her tightly, one hand at her back, the other cradling her head, like she might slip away if he let go. I'm not going anywhere, he murmured, and she believed him. For the first time in a long time, Rose didn't feel like she was holding her life together alone. In the middle of the wreckage, she had found something whole. The morning after the storm, the sky over Hartwell was washed clean, a clear, crisp blue that stretched wide above the town like a fresh page. The bakery, though water-damaged and dim without power, stood intact. The smell of soaked wood had begun to fade, replaced by the faint, comforting scent of coffee brewing from the emergency French press Rose kept stashed in the office, just in case. Rose sat at the small table in the back room, her hair pulled into a loose braid, a mug warming her hands. Michael leaned in the doorway, sipping his own coffee, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him in weeks. The storm had ripped through everything, but somehow it had left the two of them standing closer than ever. So, he said slowly, a cautious smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, are we, whatever comes after just co-workers who occasionally fall into flower fights? She smirked, eyes dancing over her cup. I think we passed that line somewhere between the sugar cookie incident and last night. Good, he said, stepping into the room, because I wasn't sure if the power outage counted as a romantic moment or just a shared near-death experience. Little bit of both, she murmured. They kissed once, softly, in the quiet, between laughter and the mess they'd still have to clean up. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't dramatic. It was just right. Still, being together didn't magically untangle everything. Later that week, with temporary lights rigged and repairs underway, they quickly discovered that sharing a kitchen was one thing. Sharing a life inside that kitchen was another. Michael insisted on reorganizing the storage shelves for efficiency. Rose, fiercely protective of her labeled chaos, nearly throttled him with a spatula. He forgot to add cinnamon to the morning buns. She burned his favorite coffee roast in the new percolator. At one point, Lily, watching from her usual perch at the corner booth, muttered under her breath, "You two need like a bakery marriage counselor." But by the end of each day, they always came back to the same rhythm: flour-dusted elbows, shared glances over the counter, and the unshakable feeling that, even with all the bumps, this was something worth figuring out. A new beginning didn't mean everything was perfect. It just meant they'd chosen to build something real, together. Summer arrived quietly in Hartwell, slipping in on a warm breeze that carried the scent of blooming lavender and freshly cut grass. The storm damage was a memory now: patched walls, new tiles in the kitchen, and a shiny convection oven that still beeped too loud for Michael's taste. Business had picked up, and the bakery had found its rhythm again. So had they. That night, the air was thick with the kind of stillness that only comes after a long, satisfying day. The bakery had closed early, and instead of going home, the three of them, Michael, Rose, and Lily, had wandered to the backfield behind the shop, where the fireflies had begun to blink like stars just low enough to catch. Rose spread a picnic blanket over the grass while Michael pulled Lily onto his shoulder so she could reach for the lights flickering just above their heads. She giggled, fingers chasing after glowing wings she'd never quite catch. "This is the best night ever," Lily announced dramatically. "Fireflies and cookies and no bedtime." Rose chuckled, lying back on the blanket with her hands behind her head. "Careful, you're going to make that the new standard." Michael set Lily down gently before dropping beside Rose, one hand brushing hers. They lay there in the hush of evening, the town lights dim and distant, stars poking through the indigo sky. "You ever think we'd end up here?" Rose asked quietly. Michael tilted his head toward her. "What, in a field full of bugs and sugar crumbs?" She nudged him with her shoulder. "No, here, like this." He thought for a moment. "I didn't know where we'd end up. I just hoped it would be somewhere that felt like home." Rose smiled softly. "It does. It really does." Lily plopped down between them, a firefly cupped gently in her hands like a secret. "Can we always have nights like this?" she whispered. Michael looked at Rose, and she met his gaze, the answer already written in her eyes. "We'll do our best," he said. "Promise." And under a sky lit by stars and flickering light, surrounded by quiet laughter and the warmth of being exactly where they belonged, they knew they weren't just working toward a future, they were already living it. The flyer appeared on the bakery bulletin board one Friday morning, pinned between a coupon for dog grooming and a notice about a missing cat named Waffles. "Tri-County Bake-Off, local pride, regional fame." Big letters, bigger prize. A glossy photo of last year's winners beaming beside an absurdly tall, lemon meringue tower. Michael raised an eyebrow as he read it. "You ever do anything like this before?" Rose wiped her hands on her apron, barely glancing at the flyer. "Once, years ago, before the crash, before everything." He studied her. "So?" She hesitated. "It's a big deal. Press coverage, judges, deadlines, stress." "You forgot one," he said, grinning. "Fun." She laughed softly, turning back to her dough. Fun wasn't the word I was going to use. But 2 days later, she came in holding a clipboard and a pen. "Okay, if we're doing this, we're doing it right." From that moment, Sweet Marie's turned into a laboratory of flour, frosting, and barely contained chaos. The theme was tradition with a twist, which Rose both loved and loathed. Michael threw out wild ideas: maple bacon scones shaped like hearts, lavender croissants with lemon curd cores, some hits, some total disasters. Lily insisted on adding glitter to everything. "What if we make a muffin that explodes chocolate when you bite into it?" she asked one night, eyes wide with sugary dreams. Michael grinned. "Is it a muffin or a grenade?" Rose rolled her eyes affectionately. "This is going to end in flour on the ceiling. I can feel it." But something happened during those weeks of experimenting. The community started noticing. People stopped by to taste test and vote on their favorite creations. A whiteboard appeared in the shop labeled Bake Off Brainstorm Station, where regulars scrawled flavor suggestions and words of encouragement. One little girl even left a sticky note. "Miss Rose and Mr. Michael are the best team ever. You're gonna win." It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about being seen, about creating something together, something that wasn't just butter and sugar, but story and strength and second chances. As the deadline approached and their final entry came together, spiced honey bundt cakes with a surprise caramel center, Rose looked at Michael across the kitchen. "Ready to do this?" she asked. He smiled. "With you? Always?" The bake-off tent buzzed with energy, rows of tables decked with gingham cloths, portable ovens humming, and the scent of sugar and ambition hanging thick in the summer air. Vendors bustled, judges strolled, and the crowd milled with a kind of restless excitement that made even seasoned bakers sweat through their aprons. Rose and Michael had claimed their spot early, their carefully prepped ingredients lined up with surgical precision. The centerpiece of their entry, mini spiced honey bundt cakes filled with warm caramel, sat in cooling trays beside a handwritten placard that read, "Sweet Marie's, Hartwell, IL." Lily had drawn the tiny honeybees in the corners, proudly declaring them lucky. Everything was running like clockwork until it wasn't. It started with a smell, not the sweet warmth of cinnamon and butter, but something sharp, acrid, wrong. Michael turned from the display to check the last batch in the oven. "Rose," he called, voice tight, "something's off." She crossed the tent, lifted the tray, and her heart dropped. The cakes were sunken, bubbling strangely around the edges. One had cracked open, revealing a thick, burned filling. Nothing like the smooth, golden caramel they'd tested and perfected a dozen times. She rushed to the prep table and opened the container of caramel base. Her breath caught. It wasn't theirs. Different consistency. Too dark. Too bitter. One taste confirmed it. Someone had switched their filling. Michael's jaw tightened. Someone tampered with it. They glanced around the tent. A rival from Ridgeway, Daphne Martin, known for her ruthless streak and artificial smiles, stood nearby, inspecting her lemon tarts a little too smugly. She met Rose's eyes for a flicker of a second, then looked away. Rose clenched her fists. "We're out of time. The judges do final tasting in 20 minutes. Michael looked at her. "We can still fix it." "How?" He held up the emergency supply box they'd kept under the table, extra ingredients just in case. "Start melting the sugar. I'll handle the spice blend." They worked like wildfire. Rose whisked caramel over a small camp stove, while Michael cut new cake molds to bake faster and smaller. They moved in perfect sync, no hesitation, just trust and heat and determination. With 5 minutes to spare, they plated 6 golden bunts, still warm, drizzled with just cooled caramel, and topped with a sugar-dusted honey shard they'd saved for garnish. By the time the judges reached their table, Rose's hands were still trembling, but she smiled anyway, because sometimes the sweetest victories come out of the messiest kitchens. And this was a miracle made with love, fire, and just a little bit of fury. The article hit the town bulletin board the next morning, clipped from the Tri-County Gazette, and thumbtacked just below the weekly specials and above a faded flyer for line dancing at the community center. Single dad and crash survivor turned bakery into love story. From storms to sweetness, how a second chance at life became a second chance at love. Rose nearly dropped her coffee when she saw it. Lily had already found it, of course, dragging Michael across the street from the grocery store, waving excitedly and shouting, "Daddy, look, you're famous. We're famous." The photo was candid, likely taken at the bake-off, the three of them behind their competition table, cheeks dusted with flour, laughing at something only they could hear. Rose's hand rested gently on Michael's arm. Lily, front and center, was holding up one of their spiced bunts like a trophy. Rose stared at the headline, her heart skipping, in that same disoriented, nervous way it had when she first kissed Michael in the quiet after the storm. "I didn't even know they were writing this," she murmured. Michael leaned over her shoulder, reading aloud in his warm, amused voice. After surviving a devastating car crash and walking away from a high-powered life, Rose Carter found more than recovery in Hartwell. She found home, healing, and an unlikely partner in former mechanic and single father, Michael Sanders. Duh. He raised an eyebrow. "You ever think we'd end up in the newspaper?" "Not unless we burned down the bakery," she muttered. The article went on to talk about the bake-off miracle, the comeback story of Sweet Marie's, and the unexpected bond between two people who never saw love coming. Customers began trickling in early, buzzing with excitement. Maggie from the flower shop brought roses. Someone else dropped off a hand-painted sign that read, "Love is the secret ingredient." Michael watched Rose move through the shop with something new in her eyes. Pride, yes, but also peace. The town didn't just know their story now. They were part of it. And as Rose looked at the paper one last time, then across the room to where Michael and Lily stood beneath the hanging lights and the sweet scent of bread, she thought, let them read about it. Because for the first time in a long time, she was ready to be seen. It happened on a quiet Tuesday, the kind that didn't feel like it should hold anything extraordinary. The bakery was closed early for the afternoon. Summer drifted lazily through the open windows, warm and golden, carrying the scent of fresh lavender and vanilla. Lily was at Maggie's flower shop across the street, helping organize tulips and spilling secrets only 7-year-olds could get away with. Michael had asked for just a few hours alone in the kitchen. No customers, no distractions. Rose didn't question it. She trusted him now, not just with the bakery, but with everything that mattered. When she walked in, the lights were dimmed and the prep tables were cleared. At the center of the counter sat a single bundt cake, honey-spiced, perfectly golden, and still warm. No bells or whistles, no glitter or powdered sugar hearts. Just one thing, a folded recipe card resting beside the cake, written in Michael's blocky, careful handwriting. Rose picked it up. Recipe, title, forever. Prep time, 1,000 mornings. Ingredients, 1 stubborn mechanic, 1 brilliant baker with walls like castles, 1 wild, brilliant kid with a sugar addiction, equal parts laughter, patience, and second chances. A dash of fear stirred until it disappears. Instructions, mix gently, let rise slowly, never rush. Bake in a warm kitchen with plenty of love, best served together every day. She smiled, blinking fast, until she saw the last line, scribbled in a messier scrawl, like he'd written it twice to get it right. Will you marry me? Forever. With you, and Lily too. Rose pressed a hand to her mouth. The card trembled in her fingers as she looked up. Michael stood in the doorway, nervous and hopeful, holding a silver ring box he hadn't even opened yet. I didn't know if you'd want the big speech, he said softly, stepping closer. But I thought, if I could promise you anything, it should be something we already know how to make together. She didn't say anything right away. She just walked forward, wrapped her arms around him, and whispered against his shoulder, yes, 1,000 times yes. And in that small, flower-scented bakery, they sealed the recipe with something better than icing, a kiss that promised forever. The ribbon fluttered in the breeze, red and satin, and tied across the new doorway, like the bow on a present that had taken years to unwrap. Sweet Marie's had doubled in size, an entire second room added for seating, events, and the occasional overambitious bake-off prep. The new sign gleamed in the summer light, freshly painted in soft gold script, Sweet Marie's Bakery and Cafe. Below it, someone had added a chalkboard sign that read, Love Baked, Fresh Daily. The town had shown up in full force. Kids darted between tables with sugar cookies in hand. Neighbors mingled over fresh coffee. Music played from a small speaker near the front window, and the scent of honey, lemon, and cinnamon hung in the air like a celebration all its own. Michael stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up and smile wide, helping a line of regulars who now felt more like family. Lily was perched proudly on a stool near the pastry case, handing out sample muffins with the flair of a professional hostess. And Rose? Rose stood in the center of it all, wearing a white sundress smudged with powdered sugar, her eyes soft and shining as she watched the space fill with laughter, light, and love. Maggie raised a glass of sparkling cider during the toast. To Rose and Michael, to second chances, flower fights, and a bakery that somehow managed to hold this town, and each other, together. Applause erupted. Rose blushed. Michael kissed her cheek, right there in front of everyone. After the crowd had thinned and the last cupcake was boxed, Rose stepped outside onto the back porch, the sky above painted with streaks of orange and pink. Michael joined her, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. Think we'll survive the expansion? She asked, sipping slowly. "Think we already have," he said, nudging her shoulder with his. They stood in silence, watching Lily chase fireflies across the back lawn, her laughter like music. "This is it, isn't it?" Rose said softly. "The life we didn't know we needed." Michael smiled, reaching for her hand. "And the one I'll never stop choosing." And as the stars began to blink awake, the lights inside the bakery glowed warmly behind them, proof that sometimes the sweetest endings are just the beginning. It rained that morning, just like it had 5 years ago. Not the violent, crashing kind of storm that upends the world, but a steady, whispering rain, gentle, cleansing, the kind that lingers on windows and makes everything feel quieter, softer. Rose stood alone in the bakery before sunrise, the lights still off, the ovens cold. Outside, Main Street was silent, the world not yet awake. She sipped her coffee and stared at the misted window, her reflection faint and calm. Today marked 5 years since the crash, 5 years since the night her life skidded off the road, quite literally. Since everything she thought she wanted dissolved into sirens and fear and the quiet grip of a stranger who pulled her from the wreck without ever asking for anything in return. She thought about the woman she'd been, ambitious, always running, always reaching, a woman who believed success came in square footage and status. And she thought about the man who showed her, in one rain-soaked moment, what real strength looked like. That man now shared her kitchen, her daughter's laughter, her forever. The front door creaked open, and Michael stepped inside, brushing rain from his shoulders. He didn't speak, just walked over, set down his bag, and wrapped his arms around her from behind. She leaned into him, their silence speaking more than words ever could. "Did you remember what day it is?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never forgot," he said. "How could I?" They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in quiet, the bakery holding them in its familiar warmth. Eventually, Rose stepped forward, flicked on the light, and moved to the counter. She reached into the recipe box, worn and stained from years of use, and pulled out a card with a title written in her neat, careful script. Second Rise. Below it, a note in smaller letters, for the morning after everything changed. She set out the ingredients slowly, methodically, and Michael joined her at the prep table, sleeves rolled, eyes steady. And together, as the rain tapped gently on the windows, they began again, just as they always had, kneading the past into something new, rising side by side,